I'm Tim Searchinger at the Woodrow Wilson School, and I work on global food and agriculture, so it is a particular delight that we have such a distinguished speaker with us today, Dr. María Loboguerrero. She is the head of global policy research at the CGIAR system. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, the CG system is what was set up as the system that started as plant breeding institutions that was set up by the U.S. and the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1960s as part of the Green Revolution. And it gradually expanded to deal with a broader set of issues, including climate change and including social research, which explains our speaker. She is an economist by training, has a PhD from UCLA, and in addition to many years of distinguished research now on the CG system, she previously, seems to, as far as I can tell, was more or less the all-purpose climate and environment planner for Colombia, where she led the formulation of the Colombian climate change policy, the National Adaptation Plan, the National Development Plan, and made major contributions to the low-carbon growth strategy, leaving almost nothing for anybody else in Colombia to do. So, and the last thing I'll say is that I'm always a little bit suspicious, who publishes good papers, whatever. So before we invited Anna, I called around my friends in the CG system, and they all said she was absolutely aces. So with that, thank you so much for coming, and please give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Really kind words. I'm very happy to be here with you all during your lunchtime. Hopefully, this will inspire and promote actions towards thinking about food systems, climate change, agriculture, food security, and so on and so forth. So, what I thought that would be interesting to share with you during this time was some of the things that we have been doing through the research program, but mostly the ones that have been related to bridging the gap between the science that we generate, not only we, but many partners that work with us generate, and the policy, the decision-making world. So things that we have learned from our successful stories on how really to connect these two worlds of science and policy. So let me give you a little bit of outline of what I'm going to present to you in the following 45 minutes. So Tim already introduced a little bit the CGIAR in general. I'm going to introduce CCAFS. CCAFS stands for the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. So just say some few words about CCAFS. Then a little bit of discussion on the challenges, why we believe that we do interesting and important things in CCAFS, and very much related to what has been called climate smart agriculture. Then I'm going to go through 3 stories, nice, beautiful, inspiring studies or stories of how we have been able to communicate, to get these two worlds, science and policy, get together. Then I'm going to say some few words about a very exciting initiative that we are working right now on transformation of food systems, thinking about climate change. And again, this is work in process. And then I'm going to finish with some reflections, thoughts about what has been these past 7 years of my life, I guess. So let me start with the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. So we do research. We are a research program. We work in 5 regions. We work in East Africa, West Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And in these 5 regions, we work through 4 flagships, 4 main flagships. Let's see if this works. Yeah. So the first one, it's on relation to policies and priorities for climate smart agriculture, so working with different stakeholders to really consider different methodologies on how we can do policy, not only help to formulate but implement policy with respect to climate smart agriculture. The second flagship is more on climate smart technologies and practices, so generating the right evidence and then being able to understand how to scale these technologies and practices up and out. The third one, it's very related to working with different governments and producing tools, metrics for helping different stakeholders to go into these low emission development pathways for agriculture and also considering the food system. And the fourth flagship is more related to climate risk management, so many things in relation to climate services, safety nets, again thinking more on the climate variability side of the story. So it's a matrix, 5 regions, 4 flagships, and then we have 2 cross-cutting learning platforms that work with all flagships, all regions. One of those is on climate smart agriculture, gender, and social inclusion. So making able that we understand what's the relationship between specifically gender, youth, social inclusion into promoting this kind of technologies and practices. And the second one, it's on partnerships and capacity for scaling climate smart agriculture. So we work with all 15 centers. I was telling team that now we are embarking on all these mergers, so now we are fewer centers, but as of the beginning of this year, we're 15 centers. These centers are all over the world. They are doing research. They are international research centers doing or generating knowledge on many different things in relation to the agricultural sector, including rice, livestock, biodiversity, policy, fish, agroforestry, and I am based at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia. And CIAT is a very important center for this research program, the one on climate change, because it's the one that is leading the research program. So we work with all 15 centers, but still a lot of the agenda it's being driven by CIAT. But so something really interesting about CCAPS, which it's like what motivates me and inspires me very much to work on this, is that somehow we play this role of being able to connect or translate all the really nice relevant knowledge that is being generated in all of these centers, in the laboratories in all of these centers. So the idea is that what we do is connect this knowledge with the decision-making world. And this could be governments at the national level, at the local level. This could be producers associations. This could be the private sector in general, or in particular the farmers. So again, it's a really interesting job in terms of connecting. Again, connecting this great knowledge, so going beyond the publication of papers, but like going even farther in terms of really being able to generate impact. So that's, and you will see that part of the stories that I'm going to tell you are very related with respect to this integrating role. So let's start a little bit with the challenges. So many challenges with respect to climate change. One really related to adaptation. So there are many different studies, and you can go into the IPCC and look for a lot of these that are showing, are like generating evidence that yields are, or reduction in yields are already occurring because of climate impacts. And then just like some like numbers, but there are many, many more out there. This is for maize and wheat. Obviously, it depends on the countries, like the characteristics, and therefore the climate impacts are different. But in general, what we are observing for maize is a reduction because of climate impacts, a reduction in yields of around 4% and around 5% for wheat. So really interesting challenge in terms of understanding what is going on with respect to changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, and what's the impact on that on yields, different crops. But then comes another challenge, very relevant and important challenge, which is the one in relation to food security and somehow the productivity side of things. And I don't know if you have heard that recently a lot of people are talking about the triple burden of malnutrition. So it's not only the challenges that we are facing with respect to undernourishment and micronutrient deficiency, but it's also a huge challenge that we are starting to experience with respect to big numbers in terms of overweight and obesity. And what it's also really challenging is that 98% of these people that are suffering from this triple burden of malnutrition live outside of the high-income countries. So it's something that it's really challenging the livelihoods of many people in the developing world. And therefore, then thinking about reducing poverty, thinking about reducing hunger are really, really integrated in terms of what is happening with respect to food production, what is happening with respect to agricultural productivity, and what is happening with respect to rural incomes, but also what is happening in terms of the type and the quality of food that we are having. And the third part, the third leg of the table, it's one that it's related to mitigation. So, you know, the emissions of greenhouse gases, because of many things that we are doing, are contributing to the changes in temperature, the changes in precipitation. So it's a very close link between agriculture. So around 75% of global deforestation is because of agriculture. And then we have a huge challenge in terms of looking into the future. So many analyses, what they suggest is that if these trends continue, then about 10 million kilometers squared of land will be clear by 2050 to meet food demand. So that's a huge challenge in terms of deforestation. But what are the good news? And that's what motivates us to do something about it. Well, what some studies suggest also is that alternative pathways, meaning different type of technologies, could only require about 2 million kilometers squared of land to be clear to satisfy the food demand. So there's a huge agenda in here to engage in many things that we can do, but that we need to do them now. And then in terms in general of agriculture and the mitigation processes, so in here when you have a graph, in this gray color or blue are the emissions of agriculture and changes in the use of land, and then in yellow you have the emissions that are coming from other sectors that are not agriculture or land use change. And then in this bar what you have is the business as usual. So if we all continue doing things the way that we are doing them right now, this is going to be the proportion of agriculture and changes in the use of land compared to other sectors. But again, what happens if we continue in the agricultural sector doing the same things and we consider this goal of by 2050 not going beyond 2 degrees Celsius? Well, if we don't change the way that we do things in agriculture, and also this includes changes in use of land, then we will be responsible for around 70% of the total emissions. And then if you see this graph, which is also really interesting, this is coming from a paper that was published by one of our scientists, Lini Wallenberg, in 2016 with many, many other people. And what they did in here was to run many models and do a lot of analysis, trying to understand what should be the contribution of agriculture in terms of reducing emissions. So according to the analysis, agriculture needs to reduce methane and nitrous oxide in 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year by 2030 if we want to remain between the 2 degrees Celsius limit. So if we don't want to go beyond 2 degrees Celsius limit, so increasing temperature more than 2 degrees Celsius limit, then that's what the agricultural sector, this is without including land use sector, which changes a little bit, but this is agriculture. This is what the agricultural sector needs to do. So that's already challenging. But if we include this second piece of information, it's making things even more scary. And again, what they did in this paper was to address what is going to happen if everybody, all the world, implements the current technologies, the ones that are in place, And if that happens, then we are only going able to reach 20 to 40% of that goal. So that's a huge agenda in terms of blue sky technologies. So again, we need to push more like technologies that can help the agricultural sector to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. And therefore, you put these three challenges together, then you start talking about something that has been around for a lot of years, long time now, which is this concept of climate smart agriculture, which considers challenges in relation to adaptation. So remember, what are the impacts that climate change and variability have on yields, on crops in general, the pillar of food security and productivity, and the one on mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions or capturing CO2. So, and again, what is interesting about this, this view of understanding these three challenges, it's that, and that comes a lot for going into the ground and really trying to understand how farmers like make decisions with respect to the way they farm. So a lot of these things, these challenges with respect to adaptation, mitigation, food security, and productivity, they are very linked. It's hard to under some circumstances to differentiate them. So the approach that climate smart agriculture proposes is to really trying to understand that that's a lot of the knowledge that we generate. It's with respect to understanding what are the synergies and trade-offs between these three for the agricultural sector, but going beyond that as well. And it's considering a food system approach. So it's not only the production side in terms of the crops, but it's also considering the supply chain and the different stages where we can have opportunities for thinking about these challenges. And something that it's very interesting about climate smart agriculture as well is that it very much reflects the importance of understanding contexts for really being able to implement successfully these type of technologies or practices. And therefore, a lot of the work we do is really trying to see what's the interaction, and through different analyses, understand the interaction between these technologies that are contributing to mitigation, adaptation, food security, and variables that are very context specific in terms of for instance, political variables, institutional, cultural variables, and then trying to see how do they work together. And then, therefore, trying to generate evidence or more understanding on under which circumstances these kind of technologies, services can be successfully adopted by farmers and in general by stakeholders that interact in the food systems. The agenda is very close to the Sustainable Development Goals, so again, very well aligned. So a lot of the research, the knowledge that we generate, it's in relation to this concept, just as the way as I explained it. So in CCAPS, we want to contribute to changing the world. Of course, we know that we are not going to be able to do it by ourselves. We're a small research program. So in the heart of our theory of change, of how we do things, it's a lot of understanding how to work with partners. Which partners should we engage in which way? But these are the key things that we believe that are strategies with partners to contribute to change the world with respect to climate change, agriculture, food systems, and food security. And I'm going to emphasize, so the stories that I'm going to tell you are very much related to this strategy. And I'm going to say a little bit about the helping set global agendas in the transformation initiative, but we do things in all of this. And that's why I was emphasizing the importance of the partnerships with private national agencies. But I'm going to focus on this one because I thought that it could be interesting for you to hear about. So let's start with this paper. So that was a paper that came out from a science meeting that we had back in, I think it was 2016. And it's a really interesting paper because what we do in this paper was to analyze the different outcomes that CCAFs have achieved in the first 6 years of like working. And then in terms of informing policies, outcomes like very well related to policy. And then from that analysis, and we had many interviews with the leaders that were working on these projects that were able to generate these outcomes. And from that analysis of the different surveys and responses to the question, we came up with these somehow, how do you can call this, conceptual framework, which is basically lessons from what we were seeing in these different projects. And again, we test these three main dimensions with respect to these successful outcomes coming from the research. And then they were doing very well with respect to these three. So this first one, evidence, is the one that we usually work on. So we as like research community at the university, academia, generating knowledge. So we believe that it is very important. We need to generate the evidence. We need to do the research. We need scientific credibility. We want people out there to use our research for informing any type of decision. So it is very important. But there's another component here that it's not always in our minds, and it's the importance of being flexible enough in terms of this research that we are generating and opportunistic in the sense that it should be there at the time that it is needed. But again, very important. And all of these projects that were successful in terms of generating outcomes, very strong evidence, and therefore very important to publish in good journals so that we have very robust science. But what we learned very fast is that this is not enough. So just having the evidence is not enough to being able to really make people use it to inform any type of decision. So then the other thing that came out from that analysis was the importance of the engagement. And that included a lot of participatory approaches to do research. But again, thinking about to include like the different stakeholders or our users from the very beginning. Usually we think that we start with the research, we take our time, and then we're ready to start interacting with the people that are going to use these results. And it is not very successful like that. So a lot of the times from this analysis, what it came was that even thinking about the research questions with the people from the governments, for instance, that were the ones that could use this type of knowledge was really, really important. So including these stakeholders, this user from the very beginning of these projects was very important. And then the third one that we believe that was part of the successful stories as well was the importance of the outreach. And again, communication. So again, if we want to be able to provide information, provide knowledge to people so that they can use it, then we need to be really careful about the way that we communicate it. And also capacity building, empowerment of like the different tools that we develop, the different technologies. So if we want this like knowledge to be used, if we want projects to be sustainable over time, very important to devote resources to capacity building as well. So three key things that you are going to see throughout the three stories that I'm going to tell you. So let's start with the first one. So this is work that we did with Colombia. So for the people that are not familiar with the NDCs are the National Determined Contributions. This is in the context of the Climate Change Convention from the United Nations. So these are somehow commitments that each one of the countries that are part of the Convention for Climate Change, so commitments that each country does in front of the international community, and basically it's a policy document where they state where they want to prioritize their actions with respect to adaptation and mitigation. And different ways of constructing these commitments. This is the case of Colombia, but in general what they do have is a target for the reduction in emissions. So in the case of Colombia, at the end of the day, the NDC goal, the National Determined Contribution goal, is to achieve 20% reduction on emissions by 2030. So when we started interacting, the research program of CCAPS started interacting with the government of Colombia, specifically with the Ministry of Environment and Agriculture, there was a great challenge in terms of lack of good data to model and to say something and to do analysis with respect to the agricultural sector. So basically it was not only agriculture, it was agriculture, forestry, and used land sector. So it's a sector that aggregates all of that. So at that point that we started interacting with the government, they were close to say, you know, we have decided that we are not going to include the AFOLU, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, in the NDC commitments, which was really bad for the sector because that meant that a lot of the resources that were going to be channeled to the implementation of activities that could reduce emissions were not, so AFOLU wasn't going to be part of this story. It was going to be left out of the party. And for us, I mean, that was a lost opportunity in terms of relevance, in terms of resources for working on the topic in Colombia. So, so fortunately, we were working before that for a while with IFPRI. IFPRI is the institution, is the International Research Institute for Food and Policy, which is based in Washington, D.C., is part of the CG, and it's part of SICA, so our research program. And we had developed this ensemble of models, which was very, very nice to interact with policymakers in terms of these targets, mitigation targets. And it was interesting because it was a macro model that considered prices, you know, food prices, trade, things that were very key in terms of understanding the optimization for the land, for the use of land in Colombia. But that was too macro for the decisions that were needed at this time. So we ensemble, we use another type of model, which was a land use model, which was really telling us through like a optimization process, telling us for each pixel in Colombia, what was, in terms of optimization, what would be the use, the most efficient use of the land. And then we ensembled that with a crop model, which was basically giving us information with respect to yields, information with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. So the three of them were like very interesting in terms of starting interacting with the Ministry of Agriculture, basically in terms of doing these policy exercises, these policy simulations in where we had really transparent and clear targets. So for instance, reducing the hectares for livestock in 50% in Colombia. And then we started working with them in terms of doing this policy analysis and then trying to understand what were the implications of these different policies. So, so the models, and again, here is the evidence, was important because the models were working. We had the same approach in Vietnam, and it was really successful with them. But going beyond that, something that was really interesting from this case was, again, the role that CCAPS, and in this case it was CCAPS, our research program with the Ministry of Environment. This is Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, so this is environment, and how we were able to connect all the simulations, all the models that the IFPRI, and this was also with Universidad de los Andes, which is a local university in Colombia. So to connect everything that was happening here with respect to the modeling with this world where was like making decisions in terms of what was being written down in the policy document, in the National Determined Contribution document. And that this included the Ministry of Agriculture, this included the National Planning Department, producers organization as well. So it was a really interesting case on how really we were able to connect these two worlds. Very relevant outputs in terms of science came out from this process. So again, importance to generate the evidence. So this, especially this one, is with respect to the approach of the three models that we used. But one paper that was really interesting from our side with respect to that role that CCAPS was performing at that time was this paper that was published in Climate Policy. And it is really interesting because what we did in that policy was to really discuss how we were able to inform these climate policies, specifically the NDC, through this institutional collaboration. And we discussed things with respect to really being able to connect the two worlds, being able to generate this trust between the different institutions, the scientists being able to have a lot of flexibility to go to the different meetings that were convened by the ministries, and so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting case on how this all work, all the pieces of the puzzles were there. So at the end of the day, what happened was that first, the AFOLU sector was included in the NDC, and then we informed this number of the 20% that was decided to put in the policy paper as the required reduction in emissions for Colombia. So that's the first case with respect to policy. The second case, it started in Colombia, but it goes beyond Colombia. It's Latin America, and it's very much related to climate services. So again, the use of climate information to make better decisions. And a little bit the rationale behind this, why did we started working on this, was because in general, in most of the countries, you have the meteorological offices, the ones that are in charge of producing the forecasts. So the ones that tell you in 3 to 6 months what is going to happen with respect to temperature, with respect to precipitation. And that happens around the world, and the methodologies, the models are there. And it's doing well with respect to that. But then if you see how many farmers are really using this information to make decisions, specific decisions, for instance, something very simple such as planting date. How many farmers are using this climate information to decide when to plant their rice or their wheat or their maize? And very few of them. And that was the rationale behind all this process. So SICA's developed this approach, which is a really simple approach, but it has proven to be so useful. And it's basically what we do is that we created these, call it local technical agroclimatic committees. Basically, we created these spaces for 3 communities to interact. One, the climate prediction community, so we had the scientists, the climate scientists, in the room. Then we put also in the same room the crop modeling community, so all our scientists doing crop modeling. And third, we included the farmers with their local knowledge, so the ones that go into the field each day and they see what is happening with respect to their crops and rainfall and temperature, and also local institutions from the government at the local level, so very context specific. And they started interacting. So discussing climate model, discussing crop modeling, but then in the same level. So farmers were sitting at the table, and then from that discussion, what was coming out was that they were trying to answer these very specific questions, simple questions, but very important for farmers in their decision-making process of each day. So, for instance, when to plant. So according to this, the combination between these climate models, this crop modeling, we came up with these agroclimatic seasonal forecasts. But the farmers were also part of those forecasts. And then with that information, again, they were trying to answer very basic questions, as for instance, what varieties to plant according to that climate information. When to apply the water, when to apply the fertilizers. And then this conversation was translated into what we call these local agroclimatic bulletins, which are basically specific adaptation actions that farmers can do now, go out and do it, based on this climate information. And this was disseminated through the same farmers to the rest of the farmers that were acting at that locality. So that's the approach. Again, it's a very, very simple approach, and it started like a pilot. So we said, let's see what is going on. But something really interesting that happened was the scaling process of this approach and what we have accomplished by now. So something to highlight, the power of South-South exchanges. And this project, it didn't start in Colombia, it started in Senegal. So in Senegal, which is part of our countries that we work on, we had like this that started around 2012. We had this project on climate information, on climate services, and really successful in terms of the farmers were using the climate information to make decisions. Obviously, very different conditions compared to Colombia in terms of climate, in terms of institutions. But we said, you know, this is something that I think that, or we thought that the Colombian people should see what was going on in Senegal with respect to the use of climate information. So back in 2014, we brought these people from Colombia and Honduras, from the government, from the universities, from the Met Office. So we brought them to Senegal to see what was going on. People were so excited when they came back to Colombia that we started implementing and thinking about how to use what we have learned, what we have seen in Senegal, and then make or develop an approach that was tackling the same issue. So we started with a pilot in 2 locations in Colombia. That was back in 2014. Then this was so successful and farmers were so excited and were using the information. They started in 2015. The government decided to establish 3 more of these. We engaged in another South-South exchange between Honduras and Colombia. And then 2016 and 2017, really interesting year for this process. So in 2016, we were on NDCs, again, the same NDC, but this was more related to the adaptation side of the story in Colombia. So because of this process that was already happening in 2014, in 2015, the Ministry of Environment in Colombia decided to include in this policy document that they were going to commit to establish 15 of these committees by 2030. And then in 2016, because of this exchange and what was happening in Colombia, in Honduras, the Ministry of Agriculture establishes 3 of these committees, and something really interesting happened in 2017, which was that through a national law, the Ministry of Agriculture decides to promote this type of spaces, this type of committees, this type of conversations. We went all the way into Nicaragua. 3 of these are implemented in Nicaragua. In 2018, Guatemala also is part of this. Then a regional strategy that FAO was promoting with other partners on risk management for the agricultural sector for Latin America and the Caribbean. Then because of all this process that was happening in the region, they decided that these committees were going to be a priority for implementing this regional strategy. By 2018, Colombia had already 10 of these, 10 out of the 15. Chile, we went in more into the south. Chile establishes its first committee. This year, the Central American Agricultural Council and the leader in managing water resources in Central America supports publicly and through documents this network of committees. We had another South-South exchange with South American countries. Paraguay establishes its first committee. As a result of all these things that I just mentioned, more than 500,000 farmers are receiving right now in Latin America agroclimatic information, but not only receiving the information, which is just half of the story. They are using this information for these decision-making processes, and we have evidence that there have been reduction in losses because of extreme weather events. Over 200 institutions are part of this network already, and these are not research institutions. These are institutions, growers association, local institutions that are part of these like spaces that we have generated. So by now, what's the picture that we have from this? We have 7 countries, more than 31 of these committees, 500,000 farmers, and 2 really nice outcomes in terms of informing policy. The one that I just mentioned of the NDC, which basically the goal is to establish 15 and to get to 1 million farmers with access to this type of information. And the second one is this that I mentioned with respect to Latin America and the Caribbean, is the climate risk management strategy for agriculture and food and nutrition security. And this approach was prioritized as one of the 5 key areas for implementing the strategy. So again, really interesting cases on the scaling and how we were able to use the evidence generated to work with different partners in terms of promoting and being able to reach many more farmers with this approach. research output from this work, which is also very relevant. This one right here is with respect to this forecasting or seasonal precipitation, which was used in much of our work that we were doing in these committees. But this one here, which was published in 2018 in Climate Risk Management, which again is not the traditional paper that we publish, but again, we think that it's super powerful in the sense that it tells the story of how, through these committees, we were able to bridge the gap between climate science and the farmers in Colombia. And very much what was really excited about that was to see how when farmers get involved into these processes, when they're part of the solution, when they're not just like left for the end, they get engaged and they want to use the information. It has been always really hard for farmers to really make use of climate information for their decision-making process. So that's my second story. And then let's go into the third one. Third one is for Central America. So it's with respect to this climate smart agriculture regional strategy for the SICA region. The SICA stands for the Integrated System for Central America, include all 8 Central American countries, including the Dominican Republic. So here, what we did was we contributed to the formulation of this CSA strategy. And the way that we did it, which is key for the outcomes that I'm going to present, it's through these future scenarios process. And so CCAPS has a really strong socioeconomic scenarios program. And the way that we use these scenarios, it's had like 3 phases or 3 stages. So, and again, before going into the 3 stages, so basically the way that we see these future scenarios is as a way to future-proof public and private planning and investments in relation to climate change, and you are going to see how we are doing that. So we start with interacting with the stakeholders from the different ministries: agriculture, environment, finance, health, and then we engage into this conversation with them in terms of thinking about the future, thinking about a vision. So thinking about how do you want to see your country, your region, whatever, in 2030 or in 2050. And then we work like backcasting. So we try to analyze or to discuss what are the pathways to get into that vision, and what are the key variables, what are the key assumptions, what are the key challenges or bottlenecks in order to get to that vision. So we get a lot of information from stakeholders, the ones that are formulating or that are in charge of formulating the policy. And then we construct the models, so the scenarios, sorry. So we work with C-PREE, we work with EASA, and then we use as input of our models, economic models, we use this information that we get from stakeholders. So we run the models, and that includes the climate part as well. So we run the models, we get our scenarios ready, and again, the algorithm that we use is to produce different scenarios, but very plausible. So we are considering different futures, and again, this is not saying what is going to happen. These are scenarios, but we construct them in a way that they are very different, each one from each other, but they are plausible. And then what we do is this third part or third stage of the process, which is the one that is really key, which is going back with and interacting with the stakeholders and then test the policies, the strategies, the investment plans, test them against these scenarios that, again, are very different but are plausible. Most of the times what happens is that there are many things that were not considered in the process of formulating the policies that are now being considered once that we are testing them against these scenarios and that we have the opportunity to include them. So we somehow make more robust policies that consider these different scenarios, and the process is one in which it's easier for policymakers to do these long-run policies that imply making decisions under a context where there is a lot of uncertainty. So this is the way that it works, and I'm going to show you how it really worked in Central America through the Climate Smart Agricultural Regional Policy. So again, some few references with respect to the science behind this. So this one this was one of the first papers that was published with respect to this scenario-guided adaptive action on food security and climate change. But more important than that one, which is a little bit old, is this, and this is a methodological guide that we wrote it with C-PREE, but also with national institutions from Central America. This is in Costa Rica, UCI. And it is a really interesting methodological guide because what we do in here is we present 4 cases where we have used this methodology to inform Latin American policy formulation processes. And a lot of lessons learned, but again, this was published in February 2019. By now, more than 5 governments in the regions have used the guide to really change somehow the way that they formulate policy. And this is a huge change from the way that policy is formulated in Central America. This is really like changing behaviors with respect to these processes. And I'm going to, and hopefully I can demonstrate why this is so important in terms of implementation of the policy. So, so we did it. We helped them with the different, here are all the different ministries of agriculture that participated in this process. This is the strategy, the CSIAR strategy. And something really interesting that happened again here was that we were able to work not only the technical side, but also the donors, the institutions that are do things in terms of climate change and agriculture in the region. So we work together in this process of formulation of the policy or the strategy using these scenarios framework. And this was also something relevant for the region. One of the main critiques that we heard when we started working in Central America was that there were a lot of resources going into climate change and agriculture, but every institution was doing its own thing. So small pilot here, small pilot there. The money stopped going into these places, and then nothing happened. Not changes, really wasn't the most effective way to use resources for the region. And then what really was very interesting and surprising for me is that this CSIAR strategy we finally formulated, and what happened was that money that was going to be invested from these different organizations in working on climate change and agriculture in Central America, what happened was that this money was directed or was channeled to implement what was in that CSIAR strategy. So it somehow, it was used as a vehicle to coordinate the resources that the institutions were going to use anyways. That's true. But again, this served, and part of that was through the process that it was formulated. So we were all coordinated with a main goal, and the main goal was to implement what was in that strategy, because the different institutions that were part of the formulation believed that those were the key things that needed to be implemented if we wanted to start thinking about resilience, adaptation, mitigation in the agricultural sector. So we just did a very simple exercise trying to add up what was going on right now, and then around $2 million have been investment from different institutions, different projects into starting implementing this CSIAR strategy. And again, this could sound like something similar, but it's a really different way to allocate resources and to formulate policy in the region. We have been working with this scenario process in Latin America. So this in red is the example that I just showed you, but we have many examples of doing a very similar work with different types of strategies, policies, investment plans in Latin America. So those are my 3 cases with respect to bridging the gap and learning from how to connect these science and decision-making processes. So now let me tell you a little bit about this 5th strategy that I thought was in my slide with respect to how we see that we can contribute to change in the world with respect to these topics. And this is very much related to food systems. And again, through our work, what we realize is that the challenges with respect to climate change are so huge that we are not going to be able to tackle those challenges if we just stay in the production side of things. We need to have an approach in which we consider the whole food system. And again, part of the rationale behind engaging into this was doing an assessment on how the global food systems are behaving right now. What is going on with respect to that? It's the pathway, the one that we would like to continue with respect to food systems or not. So if you could think of coming up with a report card for the food systems, what would be your conclusion with respect to that report card in terms of the different dimensions of the food system? So if we want to start thinking about quantity of food produced, well, in general, for quantity, I mean, we still have some challenges, but in general, we are doing pretty well. So if you think before the 2000, the real prices for food were constant, even though population was growing. So again, in general terms, we have been seeing reduction in rates of undernourishment and improving levels of nutrition and health. So well, we're doing well with respect to that. But then what happened if we move to accessibility of food produced? Not just quantity, but accessibility. And then we have seen an improvement, but now it's becoming a cause of real concern, especially because in the last 3 years, we have seen a rise in world hunger. So again, some caution in there, something is not really going the way that it should be. Then if we think about human health and nutrition, good progress overall, but again, and I discussed this at the beginning of the presentation, looming challenges in terms of obesity, overweight, triple burden of malnutrition that I was mentioning, so not so well. But then if we go into the environment, then we are really in trouble in here. Because what we have seen is that through the emission of greenhouse gases, through the use of fresh water, through the way that we are allocating the use of land, then this is becoming a really major and increasing cause of concern. So if you put all of these things together, if you could get a conclusion, then it's becoming a cause for grave concern. So really, we are not sure that we want to continue through this pathway with respect to the behavioral food systems in general. So again, this is a little bit of the rationale behind this, why we decided that it was important to think about how food systems were functioning with respect to the different dimensions. And of course, this has a lens of climate change. But then if you think about targets, how are we doing with respect to targets? And thinking about the 2030 agenda, so the Sustainable Development Goals. So in this graph, what you have, it's the percentage of undernourishment. And then in here, you have timeline. And in green, what you see is the trend required to reach 0% of undernourishment by 2030. So the 2030 agenda. And in red, what you see is what is happening right now. So we are not really there. And this is not only for undernourishment. If you try to do an exercise similar for the other variables with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals that are related to food, then you sort of have same perspective. So bad news, challenges in here, but then what's the positive side of the story? Well, I think that in general, people have come to realize that this is something that it's important to consider. And we have many institutions and many leaders working on this. So you've seen all the last weeks, people going out into the streets and just shouting because we are not happy with the way that things are going right now. This is a quote from Achim Steiner. He is the UNDP administrator, and he's basically saying that we can reach the goals of having a healthy planet, of social equality and economic opportunity, but we need to act now, because if we wait, probably it's going to be very late. So there's a call for action. You see everywhere, we need to act, we need to do things now, it's urgent, and so on and so forth. So again, real challenges, we are not really on track, but there's a lot of momentum for working on these things. So that's why we started working on this initiative on transformation of food systems under climate change. And again, this is part of our efforts to help to set global agendas with respect to different topics, and we believe that this is the time to think about that. So the main objective of the initiative is to build consensus on how global food systems need to transform and how to achieve the transformation. We put out a process where we have a globally representative group of scientists and senior technical advisors, including the private sector, because we believe that the private sector is key in terms of this transformation. And the chair of this group of experts is Achim Steiner, the UNDP administrator. So again, and just think about the paper that I started my talk with respect to the evidence, the engagement, the outreach. So all this is part of this strategy. In terms of communication, we have a webpage on the initiative, and I'd like to take the opportunity to invite all of you to see the webpage. There are a lot of resources. It's transformingfoodsystems.com. A lot of the science, a lot of the papers, a lot of the studies, you're going to find them. All of the partners that are contributing to this, you're going to find them there. Again, it's a nice way of communicating the messages that we want to deliver. And part of these messages and part of this knowledge generation are these key elements. So we started thinking about like the start of a theory of change, of thinking about this transformation of food systems under climate change. And these are 6 key elements that we consider that are key to really engage in this transformation. And if you see, they go all the way from the technologies, because they are important, but we really believe that they are not going to solve the issue. All the way to think about the importance of digital agriculture and how that can change the way that the extension systems are working. But then highlighting the importance of empowering producers and consumers organizations, considering, again, women, youth, marginalized groups. We believe that if this doesn't happen, then there's not a chance that this transformation can happen. The importance of considering supply chains, how they need to be reshaped, the importance of action in terms of food retail, marketing and procurement, the importance of thinking about diets, the importance of food loss and waste. And then, obviously, we need to consider the financial part of the story. So what are the innovative tools from the financial sector that are going to be able to allocate resources or to guide resources to invest in this transformation? And of course, in the middle of that, as you will thing that I will mention, is the policy side of the story. So this is never going to happen if we don't have the right policies and institutions that can provide the incentives for this transformation to happen. And then we have also are working on delivering some papers that are part of what we have called these areas that have the potential to redefine the way that food systems function. And 5 topics that we believe that are really relevant: the importance of acknowledging that there are different types of farmers, not all farmers are the same, and therefore the transformation pathways are going to be different, and policymakers need to take this into account. Then the second one, it's more related on the importance of policy, all the way from local to global policy as a catalyst for change. These papers are already published. These ones, we're going to release them in the following month. The third one is a really interesting paper by Sonia Vermeulen on the role of changing diets for promoting this transformation. Fifth one on these innovative tools for financing this transformation. And the fifth one is by Philip Thornton and many, many others. With respect to more thinking about the blue sky technologies, remember that we have a huge challenge again in terms of technologies. So we're thinking about these type of technologies that can really accelerate the progress towards achieving the SDGs. And then using all this information, so and all what we have learned from these years of working CCAFs, from these papers, from this theory of change, we have, and this is again under discussion, but we have been like presenting and receiving feedback in terms of these 11 key actions that can really transform food systems. And for each one of these key actions, we have specific targets. We have pathways to get closer to achieving those targets. We have priorities in terms of geography. So where do we start? And again, considering that not all farmers, not all stakeholders are equal, and consider those differences, and then some champions. Because this is an agenda that we are not going to promote, that we are not going to be able, that the targets are not going to be able to achieve by ourselves. But this implies working with many, many different partners. So I'm not going to go in detail with respect to these 11 key actions, but we cluster them so in like key groups. So one that are really related to farming and rural lives on a new trajectory, the risking lives on farms, low carbon diets and value chains, and these ones, these 3 ones that are cross-cutting and that we consider are totally key for this transformation to happen, And they are related to mobilizing society, finance, and innovation, and especially this one, which, and this is going to be part of my conclusions, in terms of the importance of being able to drive social change and changes in behaviors for this transformation to happen. Again, as I was telling you, we acknowledge that for this transformation to happen, each one needs to do its own part. So going all the way from the civil society to the countries, to the private sector, of course, the research community. We need to do research in a different way, I believe, if we want to really engage into this transformation. But again, everybody needs to do something, because if it's not this way, this is not going to happen. And I'm just going to finish by highlighting like 3 very simple, concrete, key things that I believe that are totally relevant in order to move forward this agenda. In general, the transformation, but in particular, this bridging the gap between science and the decision-making world. And it's one that I think that most of the times we are forgetting, and it's the importance of being able to fail and to understand failures. And why I am highlighting this? Because the donors community, everybody is pushing us, especially from the research community, to do things that are successful. So engage in agendas that we know that are going to be successful, and that's not always the case, and that's not the way that science is developed or knowledge. So I think that we need to do more of this, or not only being able to fail, but understanding from those failures, and then, because probably those lessons are the ones that are going to get us closer to innovate in a way that can really transform the way that we are doing things right now. The second one is the importance of really being able to understand issues around behavioral change. So if we agree that we need nothing short than a transformation in the way that the food systems and the stakeholders around the food systems are behaving, then we really need to understand what are the triggers, what are the norms that are going to really help us to engage in behavioral change, to make these things really happen. And the third one, it's with respect to, this is more related to the policy science interface, and it's, I think that there's a need for more literature on innovative methodologies to really assess the impact of this policy involvement into the outcomes, into really generating changes at scale. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, we're a little tight on time, but let's take a couple of quick questions. Why don't we get a couple of questions, then you can answer them.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for an interesting talk. I have 2 questions. The number one is that I wonder, it seems to me that climate smart agriculture, it is more reliant on the technology, is a relatively short-term solution from my point of view. And I wanted to ask you, number one, it doesn't seem like the climate, climate smart agriculture so far has addressed the key issues of food distribution, the uneven distribution of food and the accessibility of food across the globe. And I wonder what research has been done or should be done in that context. And my second question is, it seems to me that if we rely on technology to improve our climate adaptation, yes, we could, improve our crop yield over the short time scale. But over the long term, if we want to build the resilience into the food system, we have to transform the food system into something that is intrinsically resilient. And that includes both ecological practices and how people are treated in the food system, whether they access food or whether the labor construction is going to be different. And I just wonder, what do you think about different visions and what kind of vision are you pursuing at the center?
So one more question. Any other questions? Then we'll pull them all together.
It's a little generic question, but I'm interested about this. In your experience in different countries, what is the experience of points of cooperation and friction while bringing different institutions together?
Remember all 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
So with respect to the first one, I don't think that the climate smart agriculture is focused on technologies. Probably that was something that, and there was a lot of debate about that. But each time more, and I think that I emphasize when I presented the 3 pillars, it's technology is part of the story, but it's not. It's not all the story, and that's why I think that one of the interesting things of climate-smart agriculture is being able to understand the importance of context in order to really assess if something is contributing or is really climate-smart or contributing to adaptation, mitigation, food security or not. And that involves a lot of the research that we have been doing in trying to understand the linkages with respect to social, economical, political, institutional variables, and the implementation of some of these technologies. And the whole concept incorporates all of that. So I don't think that it's relying totally on technologies. Technologies are important, but are part of the story. And we, believe me, from the CGIAR side, we totally we are on the same page in the sense that if we don't understand the relationships with these other socioeconomic variables, for instance, we're never going to be able to scale the technologies that we are developing. So it's just, and these climate-smart agriculture, these are totally under some circumstances, and that's the beauty of it, that you need to understand the circumstances, but they can be totally compatible with agroecology, with nature-based solutions. They are all part of the agenda. And again, I think that one important thing is being able to understand synergies and trade-offs, which is the invitation of the concept, and also to being able to understand how interactions happen with context. And that includes what you were saying in terms of distribution of foods and so on and so forth, so the relationship between poverty. So that's also part of the agenda, really being able to understand these linkages. And you were asking about the interactions between different like communities, organizations, and things like that. Yeah, so that's a very key question. I think that there are a lot of things with respect to power relationships that are really important to tackle whenever you are going to engage in this conversation between different type of communities. There are things about silos, and all these things are challenges. But from our experience, what we have seen is that always being able to engage into these trustful relationships where you, and this doesn't come from one day to another. This comes from somehow long-term engagement, and that's why these things are hard, because it needs time. It's not that you go into the government and say, I have a model, and then everybody's going to use it. It's harder than that, and it implies flexibility, being able to be there when they call you and they say, tomorrow we have this meeting, can you be here, and then explain again what you are trying to do. And that's not always the case. But again, it's just I think it's trying to engage in this multidisciplinary approach where you are able to you sit into a table with an open mind, ready to listen to people, ready to contribute to the conversations. That's where things have really worked. And having champions, it's also really useful for these processes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Another round of applause.